Baruch atah, brothers and sisters. My name is Stephen Pidgeon, and I have been asked today to come forward with my Torah testimony. And this is something that I've not only been called to by the brothers and sisters, but Yah himself has called me to set forth this testimony for such a time as this. So I wanted to take a few minutes to go through some things that brought me on the path that I'm on. You know, I think in all of these things, Yah directs our path. It really is not up to us as to where we're going to go or how we get there or even when we get there. But rather it is Yah himself that directs our path. And he puts things in front of us that sometimes are adversarial. And he puts things in front of us sometimes that are hills to climb. But sometimes they're hills we go down into valleys rich with milk and honey. And Yah is our provider. And Yah has been my provider in every way. And so I guess I'm going to start from the time that I tossed my hands up in despair because my plans had once again arrived at catastrophic failure. Well, I shouldn't say catastrophic failure, but they were bringing me back to ground zero. I found myself in a circular cul-de-sac from which there was no ingress or egress. And it was at this time that I just tossed my hands up and I said, you know, Father, I'm not doing it anymore. It's all yours. I'm giving my life to you to direct as you see fit. Take me on the journey as you desire and let my heart's desires fade away in favor of your desires in my life. Well, Yah had something entirely different in mind for me that I had no idea. But he was really going to answer prayers that I had in my heart from the time I was 10 years old, not based upon the decisions that I was required to make when I was homeless at 15 and various ways that I had to find to survive, but rather based upon what the desires I had as a child, that he was going to satisfy those desires, that he was going to hear my prayers and begin to answer those one by one, systematically. But he didn't answer those prayers in a way that was just for the sake of answering the prayers, but rather he answered the prayers that he might structure me for later work. And so I was in a very difficult situation at the time. I was basically a high school dropout and a college dropout and selling used cars. And he took me from that and he said, you know, this is not who you're going to be. This is not who you are. And so he began to move me in a very serious way. And in just a very short period of time, I had finished a double major degree in both criminal justice and in piano performance. And then I went on to law school and secured a Juris Doctorate in law. And thereafter, I moved into becoming a lawyer. Now, when I moved into becoming a lawyer, I really wanted to do just business law. And in fact, I wanted to do basically what they call backroom law. In other words, I was going to be writing securities documents, things like private placement memoranda, option agreements, warrants, public placement documents, these kinds of things, contracts, management agreements. And so I was doing these kinds of things, but it wasn't very long before the clients recognized that I had skills of presentation in front of large groups of people. And so as a consequence, my clients started screaming for me to be their lawyer for purposes of trial. So I became a trial lawyer. That is a lawyer who spends time in front of juries. And I did quite a bit of trial work. I won't say I did a lot of trial work, but I did trial work where I did several jury trials of substantial weight. And in fact, I was the lead counsel in a jury trial 3 months after I got out of law school. So that was kind of unusual. There was a lot of money at stake, and we did pretty well. And anyway, this was kind of the progress. But what I didn't understand at the time is that Yah wanted me to understand the tenets and the premises of the law. And even though they teach a distorted version of the law now, and they're incorrect in how they teach in the law schools, teaching that there is no common law, for instance, in the United States, that's a patent absurdity. But this is what they teach at the law school. And of course, I had the chance to look at law that I didn't know existed. We were required, for instance, to learn the Uniform Commercial Code and to withstand very strident testing on a 1-year-long class on the Uniform Commercial Code. I had, as part of my studies, almost 2 years in constitutional law, 2 years in the rules of evidence. I also had a lot of pre-law classes that other lawyers did not have. For instance, I studied the history of the law under a professor who was actually quite excellent, Steve Kahn. And we also studied indigenous law, that is to say, the law of the indigenous tribes in North America, which is a very significant thing to learn the body of law of other peoples and other people groups and what they think and believe. And Yah was beginning to do things in me at that time. He was beginning to show me things that I was going to have to learn that were going to be necessary for the things that he had planned for me later on, which I had no idea what they were. I mean, they certainly weren't on my radar at all. Not at all. Not at all. Zero. And, but my wife and I moved through a lot of these things. And then as time went on, again, I was selected, even though I thought I was a securities lawyer, I was selected again for, high-level securities trials. And so we were doing jury trials again. And once we came into the 21st century, the whole paradigm changed. And things changed really quite dramatically as the world turned a corner, leaving behind things American and allowing the Holy Roman Empire in the form of the Third Reich, hidden, to take control of the United States, which is what happened with the election of, actually it happened in 1988 with the election of George H.W. Bush, that the Third Reich began to move to control America and all of Western Europe. And George H.W. Bush proclaimed the New World Order on September 11th, 1991. And these things began to change the fabric of our society. And they began to change me as well. But as we got into the 21st century, there were some things that were happening. I mean, in the late 90s, I was always looking for a better and better Bible. Because believe it or not, the first Bible I ever owned was the little green Jehovah's Witnesses Bible, which has its own uniqueness and has its own character in the private interpretation of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I was comparing that with the Bibles that I had picked up where the churches where we were attending, which were all Protestant denominational churches. In fact, we were in the Presbyterian church for a while. And they were using the NIV. And I was looking at the NIV and comparing it. I was also reading the NKJV, which I thought was a better text than the NIV. And I picked up a big NIV study Bible and was reading that. But anyway, I kept looking and looking. I wasn't finding anything. And finally, I ordered an Oxford Complete Bible, an Oxford edition. Well, I didn't know it, but the Oxford edition was actually the 1789 Benjamin Blaney version of the KJV. And so I'm looking at this book, and all of a sudden I'm seeing the Apocrypha in there. Well, I mean, this was a highly accredited source, the Oxford Unabridged Bible. So I was reading through the Apocrypha, and I read all these books and was absolutely fascinated, particularly when I read the book of 4th Ezra or 2nd Esdras. And 2nd Esdras to me was just really extremely exciting and a very beautiful book. I loved the book, and so I began an inquiry into other writings. And of course, I stumbled on the book of Jubilees, and Jubilees answered so many questions that I had in my mind. And so at this point, I began to build a green binder of texts that I really loved. And it included Fourth Ezra, and it included Jubilees, and it ultimately included Enoch. And so I began to build, what was a set of scriptures that was going to belong to me. But in the meantime, keep in mind that we're bouncing in and out of the Presbyterian church and into an evangelical church. So we ended up in an evangelical church right after 9/11. And when we did, they had this missions week. And at missions week, basically you would go out in the foyer, and they were encouraging worldwide mission outreach. Now, at that time, in the year 2000, the year 2001, private giving from Americans exceeded all of the giving into a missionary work of all the other nations on earth combined. Private giving from American believers exceeded all the other giving of every other nation combined. And so the evangelical push was really quite strident at that point. There was a big push on to go out and reach out and to promote the gospel worldwide. And of course, I wasn't sure I wanted to be a part of that, but I wasn't disheartened by it. I mean, in my prayer life, I had given to Yah the same thing that Isaiah said to Yah: "Here I am, send me. Here I am, send me." And so I walked out into the foyer there, and I'm looking around at all these things. I'm thinking, well, if I'm going on a mission, I'm going to Italy. Ha, 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 ha. Yeah. Well, it turns out I came around the corner, and here was this mission stand to go to Russia. Now, you have to remember, I grew up here in Alaska, where I currently am now. And in Alaska, we are the end of Western civilization. When you go to the west of Alaska, you enter into Russian airspace. I mean, that's what happens. And in fact, at one point, the farthest western point of Alaska is Little Diomede Island, and it faces a mile away the farthest eastern point of Russia, Big Diomede Island. So yes, you can see Russia from Alaska, from Little Diomede Island. And there's actually a great deal of Russian influence in the state of Alaska. There's Russian Orthodox churches. In fact, there's 53 Russian Orthodox churches in Alaska. And the Orthodox diocese is really quite strong here, with pretty heavy influence in southeastern Alaska, namely out of Sitka, Ketchikan, and so forth. In Haines, there are many Russian speakers there, and many people who have actually lived in Russia who are Alaskans. The town of Sitka is dominated by a Russian Orthodox church in the very center of town. And this was the seat of Russian governorship over the state of Alaska under the hands of Alexander Baranov. And the Russians sold whatever interest they had in Alaska to the United States. And this was actually a transaction that was made following the Civil War. And it was essentially a gift, if you will, that William Seward bought what was considered an icebox from Russia for $7,200,000, which was at that time an exorbitant amount of money. But when they did that, they called it Seward's Folly, that Seward would buy Alaska from the Russians. But Seward felt compelled to buy Alaska from the Russians because the Russians wanted to dump it. They didn't want their interest in North America anymore. They wanted the cash, and they wanted to be paid back in particular for putting Russian ships off the coast of California and Russian ships off the coast of New York during the Civil War to prevent Britain from openly interfering in the Civil War in the United States. Now, when you compare what happened in the Civil War in the United States to what happened in the war in South Africa, there was no one to prevent the Brits from landing in South Africa. And as a consequence, all of the work of the Boers in South Africa appears to have been for naught. All the wealth building and the civilization building that took place there was undercut by the fact that the Brits, there was no one to stop the Brits from arriving there and slaughtering the Boers and putting some 22,000 women and children in concentration camps where most of them died. So you can see that the Russians did the United States a very large favor in keeping the Brits away from the United States during the Civil War. And we repaid them by purchasing Alaska from them for $7,200,000 in 1867. Well, my parents were the sort that wanted to have, pioneering. My mother had grown up and had lived her entire life in Mendocino County, California, and where, quite frankly, nothing goes on. But at the end of the harvest, they pick walnuts and pick grapes, and that's about it for the year. And pears. She used to work picking pears, but she was a musician and brought life to that community. And so her and my father decided they wanted to pioneer in Alaska. And so we came here to live. And as we came here to live, I was pursuing music. And, I used to be a rock and roller. I played a lot of rock and roll. I toured out of Atlanta and played with a lot of acts that were very predominant back in those days. But when I turned 20 years old, I just got tired of it. And quite frankly, I was just bored with the stereotypical guitar playing. It bored me to tears. And I got tired of musicians, not wanting to practice and so forth. And so I decided I want to go on my own and I want to be able to play on my own strength. And so I literally cut the strings off my guitar, took all the guts off, put them in a cardboard box, and put my guitar up on a shelf. And I flew home and I started practicing the piano. And I practiced the piano for almost 8 hours a day, 7 days a week for almost 8 years. And as a result of this, push towards piano performance, which, by the way, the truth is that I'm a bass player turned guitar player turned piano player. I mean, that's really the truth of it. And once you're a bass player, you get very strong hands that do not lumber well over the top of a keyboard. So it took me a long time to realize that I was never going to be a concert artist, although I did many, many concerts after I graduated. I did, I think 25 concerts, and they were usually about 3 hours long, and I would play quite a few significant pieces. I mean, I played a concert when I graduated law school, for instance. That was a lot of fun. So at the end of my third year, I played a concert, and I presented the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Sonata, the Liszt Funerale. I played the Malagueña. I played 3 Rachmaninoff etudes, 3 Chopin etudes. Opened up with the, not the Scriabin, opened up with the, I'll have to think of it. Got to think of his name now. A beautiful little Baroque piece. Anyway, his name will have to come to me. But anyway, and then I finished the concert with the Brahms Handel variations. And this was how I graduated law school. So during that period of time when I was practicing law, I did a lot of piano concerts, and I wrote a lot of original music for piano solo. And I had a number of students that were excelling and doing very well. And but Yah continued to show me something, right? And he was showing something over and over again, that he was going to take the tools in my toolkit and he was going to use them for his glory. And this is something that was going to happen. Well, in Alaska, before I left for law school, we had this thing called glasnost and perestroika occur in Russia. And when this happened, a pianist from Moscow essentially left Moscow and came to Alaska. And I'm going to tell you this story just because, for the fun of it. There was a fellow here who was a brilliant engineer, and he had developed a drill bit that was very unique for the oil industry in Prudhoe Bay. And this drill bit was extremely effective and became very popular, and he made a ton of money on this drill bit. Well, when he did, he was a musician at heart, and he loved opera, and he loved piano music in particular. So he had built himself a large warehouse, and he began to sponsor the Anchorage Opera Company at his warehouse. And in his personal office, he had purchased a 9-foot Steinway, And when he went to buy the Steinway, he was talking with the builders in New York. And one of the builders said, well, I can build you a better piano than that. And the guy's name was Falcone. And so he talked to Falcone, and he had Falcone build him an instrument that Falcone believed would be superior to the Steinway. So this fellow in his office had two 9-foot grand pianos facing his desk. And then he had a $120,000 stereo system behind it. And so he would be listening to the piano work of various composers, namely Ashkenazi, who he used to listen to quite a bit, who was a great Russian performer. But Ashkenazi had a classmate at Moscow whose name was Svetlana Velichko. And Svetlana Velichka, she came to Alaska under the auspices of this fellow. And he said, look, I want you to come here and I want you to play and blah, blah, blah. And he says, I'm going to sponsor you as a university professor at UAA so that you can get your visa and so that you can end up getting, ultimately American citizenship, which she did obtain. So he flies her in for the purposes of having her sit at one of the pianos, and he would put on a recording of Ashkenazi or maybe Andre Previn or some other pianist, and he would play the recording of them playing, and then he would have Svieta play the piano herself and play it live, same pieces. Well, Svieta was an absolutely brilliant pianist. I mean, of the highest caliber. I mean, absolutely of the highest caliber. I mean, she was of the level of pianist of Rosalina Levine, who led the piano department at Juilliard for many, many years. She was the only pianist in Russian history to have graduated from the Tchaikovsky Conservatory in Moscow and be offered a teaching position immediately upon graduation. And you have to remember that Rachmaninoff and Scriabin both graduated from that conservatory. So anyway, I heard Svieta was in town. And I thought to myself, I have to come and study with her. So I would call her, I need to come and study with you. She wouldn't call me back because I was speaking English and she only spoke Russian. And so I called and called and called. And finally, after a year, she took my call because she could understand English enough at that point to understand what I was saying. And she said, yes, come over. I want to hear you play. So I remember walking into her studio, and she had a 7-foot kawaii at the back of the studio. This was in North Mountain View, for heaven's sakes. But I walked in, and she had this 7-foot kawaii in the back of the studio. And as soon as I walked in the door, she took one finger and she went, ping, with the fourth finger of the right hand, ping. And I heard this tone come off the piano, and it was like, how did you do that? That was just glorious. How did you do that? And so we talked, and she began to show me, she unleashed me as a pianist because I was trapped in a French technique from a former teacher that used to study with Alfred Cortot. And my technique was too brutal. It was too much force and too much tension in the arms, too much tension in the wrists, and so on. And she said, look, you have all the technique in the world. You just have to let go and play it. And so the last 10% I needed to become a real pianist, she gave me, and she gave it to me in a very short period of time. And so we talked, and I really thought the world of her. She was such a great pianist. And she was telling me, in fact, she invited her good friend, Victor Bunin, who was still teaching at the Moscow Conservatory, to come and hear me play in Anchorage, to hear me play the Rachmaninoff. And Victor Bunin was, the head of the department there in Moscow. And he had very constructive, the Russians don't mess around when they come to instruction. You either can or you can't, and there's no talking, but there's no, finessing it. And so he had very critically good things to say about the technique. And I began to learn many things. And of course, I was invited at this point to go to Moscow and to stay at Svieta's apartment while she was living in Alaska. She said, I still have my apartment in Moscow. You can stay in my apartment. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to Moscow. I'm not going to do that. And forget it. I can't speak Russian. You can speak Russian. I can't. But at any rate, and then I was invited to tour in Eastern Russia. And we were going to tour starting in Vladivostok. At this time, Alaska Airlines had opened up the doors and was flying into Vladivostok and Magadan and was flying into Okhotsk and I believe Yakutsk. There were, I think, 4 cities they were flying into. But they couldn't talk the Russians into fixing the runway or providing them with clean jet fuel when they landed. So it only went on for a few years, and then Alaska Airlines terminated the project. But during that period of time, many Alaskans were in and out of Russia continually, but not me. And so here I am walking around in this church just a few years later, and here's this mission to Moscow. And behind the mission to Russia, it says, "What part of go don't you understand?" And I looked at that and started laughing. When I started laughing, the fellow who led that mission group, he said, "Oh, yeah, I know you're going to Russia with us." I said, "I am." It never even occurred to me. And at this time, I was still afraid of flying. And so he says, "Yeah, come on, let's go." And so I joined up with the group. And we went to Russia. And when we went to Russia, I was just shocked. I got off the plane there at Sheremetyevo in Moscow. And I'm looking around going, okay, well, this is an interesting place. And of course, we spent a little time in Moscow at the Rossiya Hotel there on the Red Square. And so the very first day we were there, I told the team, "Look, we're in Moscow." I said, "I have to get to the Moscow Conservatory." "Oh, well, we're not going there, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Well, I'm going there, whether you guys are not." So finally, I talked to a tour guide that was taking us through the Kremlin. And I said, how do I get to the Moscow Conservatory?" He says, "You see the building right over here on the other side of the Morozhnaya Ploshchad." I said, "Yeah, I see it." He says, "Just take the Bolshaya and the Kiba Ulitsa and take that down until you come to the statue of Tchaikovsky, and you will be there." So I said, "I'm going." So 3 of my friends said, "Well, we're going with you then." And so we went, actually, there was 4 of them. Yeah, so there was a total of 5 of us. And so we walked down the Bolshoi and the Kidu Ulitsa, and we came up to the statue of Tchaikovsky. And I was like, "Okay, let's go in." And my interpreter, Dima, is like, "Don't talk to the police. Don't talk to the police. It's just going to mean money. Don't talk." I said, "Let's go. Come on, let's go ask him." And so I asked the police, I said, can we come in here?" "Oh, yeah, go ahead, go ahead." So we're walking through the hallways. And I said, "Well, I wonder if we look through here, and I wonder where this is." We're kind of cruising along. And about that time, these 2 double doors break open. "Who's speaking English out here?" I said, "It's me. I'm speaking English out here." And so I talked with this woman. She was a cello teacher. And I started speaking to her about Svieta Velichko. I said, "Svieta, yeah, she is my teacher." And she said, "Oh, I know Svieta. She plays so beautifully." And then she says to me, "Oh, my daughter is studying at North Texas State, studying music at North Texas State." Okay, hallelujah. So we went downstairs to our favorite coffee shop, Cafe Mania, and our mission work in Russia began. So we would then go down to the Vokzal, or the Kurskaya Vokzal, the train station. We would take the train down to Kursk. Kursk is a city near the Ukrainian border. And we get to Kursk to find a town that is still trapped in the Soviet Union. And what I mean by that is that there was a Soviet level of poverty in the city. And you remember that Russia went through 3 periods of deprivation following the collapse of the Soviet Union, where people were starving to death. At this time, the average lifespan for a man was 52 years, and a woman was 63. And so the life expectancy had collapsed following the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, the people lived in, basically concrete apartment buildings that were just tipped up, and, there was no real landscaping anywhere. And it was just kind of, you could see it was like, okay, we're going to survive. All of the apartment buildings in Kursk are fed by the same nuclear power plant. So there's gigantic, huge hot water pipes that come off the nuclear plant and run through the whole city. And so the apartments in the winter, they don't have a thermostat. If your apartment's too warm, open the window. And so anyway, but this isn't the main thing. What happened to me there in Kursk was that I was overtaken by the Ruach HaKodesh. Now, this had nothing to do really with the people that were there. or anything that was really going on in the mission. You could go on the mission and not experience any of this, but that's not what happened with me. What happened with me was that I was overwhelmed with the Ruach HaKodesh, and I could not believe how overwhelmed I was, quite frankly. I was in, the best way to put it was, I was the happiest I had ever been in my entire life. I couldn't believe what Yah was doing with me. And so we talked, and I met Yuri Mikhailovich and his family, a fantastic family of people. And at this time, I think I knew, 2 Russian words, das vidanya, And so at any rate, we're having to speak in Russian when we go into various places and stores and stuff, be able to communicate, to understand what they're saying. And I wanted to preach. I knew I was going to be coming back, and I wanted to teach in Russian. So I was praying for Yah to give me scriptures that I could preach in Russian. And so the scriptures that he gave me the following year were very interesting Russian scriptures. And I learned these, and I wanted to deliver these to the Russian people to speak from my heart concerning scripture. So one of these, of course, was «Придите ко мне, все трудностающиеся и обремененные, и я успокою вас». And this is, «Come to me, all ye who are weary and burdened, and I will give rest to your souls. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And then, of course, the passage that I did eventually teach on in Russia, which is from the Gospel of John. «Я на то родился и на тот пришел в мир, чтобы свидетельствовать об истине. Всякий, кто от истины слушает гласа моего». It is for this reason I was born, and this reason I came to the earth, to testify to the truth. All those who are of the truth hear my voice. Now, from this provision, and again, I was once again the following year completely encamped with the Ruach HaKodesh, and Yuri Mikhailovich tells me, he says, Stephen, нам нужно в эта страна Грузия. You need to go to the nation of Georgia. And I said, Yuri, what do I know of Georgia? I don't know Georgia. Don't know anything about it. Don't care to go. Don't want to know. He says, you speak Russian like a Georgian and you look like a Georgian. Go to Georgia. So this came upon my heart. And of course, we made yet another trip into Russia that year. We went down to the Caucasus Mountains, into the Kavkaz, and we went to Nalchik, Kabardino-Balkaria, and Kabardino-Balkaria, and of course, across the top of the Caucasus. And that was a very dangerous mission. We had no idea how dangerous it was. When we got to the airport, Pastor Pavlov, he comes to me and he says, Stephen, he says, when we walk outside the airport here, I want you to immediately get into the van and sit on the floor. Do not sit on the seat. We're going to go to this compound, and I don't want anybody to see you in the city. And so we did, and we were locked up in a compound for 4 days in order to get registered in the city. And only then could we go out and even talk to anybody. And the hostility towards Americans was very deep in that neck of the woods, very deep indeed. They didn't want to see Americans, talk to Americans, deal with Americans, transact with Americans, nothing. Anyway, so here now I'm being driven by 2 things. I'm being driven by the Ruach HaKodesh to do mission work inside of Eastern Europe. And I'm also being driven by the Ruach HaKodesh to speak about the truth. It is for this reason I came to the earth, to testify to the truth. And Pilate says, Что есть истина? What is truth? What are you talking about? What is truth? So when I came home, I began teaching on the Truth Project. And I was teaching on fundamental human rights predicated upon the 10 Commandments. So when we did finally fly into Georgia, into Tbilisi, we were some of the first missionaries in Tbilisi. And it was a very difficult place, very difficult time. Georgia was the poorest of all nations of the former Soviet blocs. And we flew in and elected to live with the believers who were living in very difficult circumstances for the most part. And here we saw many, many miracles, many, many, many miracles on the very first trip. It was remarkable what had happened. I'm not going to go into all of those here for purposes of this testimony. Well, I will. Let me just, since we're taping this, who knows? I might not be alive tomorrow. So let's give the testimony today. So when we entered into Tbilisi, we came into Georgia on the strength of a handful of emails. We had been introduced to a pastor in Georgia named Zali Tekeshishvili. And Zali was an evangelical pastor who was suffering from persecution at the time. He'd been on the run for 2 years. The Orthodox Church had tried to kill him. He had been beaten up, badly beaten up, kicked over 100 times, had his Bibles burned, materials burned in his church, and he had been scattered. And so what was left of his church was meeting in his living room where everyone would gather, because they had to gather privately and not in the public square. And so this was the condition. And we didn't know this when we went there. Zali wrote me back and said, Stephen, if you're going to come now, come later, but come. Okay. So it took us several months to put together the mission team. We had a mission team of 9 people, 4 of whom were 18 years old. And I didn't know it at the time, but we had put together a group of singers. I thought we were just putting together a mission team, an exploratory team, but Yah had something else in mind. And so one of the guys on the team, Zach, had just won the Lionel Hampton Jazz Vocalist Competition for the 2nd year in a row. And so I wrote the U.S. Embassy because I wanted the embassy to know we were coming into Georgia. So I wrote the embassy and I said, we're coming into Georgia. Oh, and by the way, we also, have got a little jazz. We can present some jazz for the ambassador if he's interested. And Rowena writes back to me and says, the ambassador hates jazz. So don't think about playing any jazz for the ambassador. But if you want, you can bring a couple of bottles of Tabasco sauce. That's the only thing you can't get here. And so we thought, okay, all right, that's great. She says, but if you're interested in doing music, we can set you up to do a performance at the Akvladiani Museum in downtown Tbilisi. Oh, okay. Well, that sounds great. Well, let's do it. She says, well, before you do that, we have to have a music resume. I thought, music resume? What are you talking about? Well, she puts me over to this Georgian gal that worked for her. And this Georgian gal was very obnoxious because, of course, the Georgians are extremely talented. And they're great musicians and they're great dancers and they're great singers. They're very culturally oriented and very talented and very proud of their talent. And she said, well, this is who we have going here. Who are you? So I sent her my music resume. And when I sent her my music resume, I sent it also to Zali. And this was on a Friday night, and we're leaving Sunday. And Zali says, well, Stephen, this changes everything. I said, you got to be kidding me. He says, no, that changes everything. I said, okay, all right. So we arrived in Georgia. And when we arrived in Georgia, we spent the first night staying at the Sheraton Hotel. Then we were going to be with believers the rest of the time we were there. And so we're staying at the Sheraton Hotel, and I'm talking with Mark and with Dustin. We're standing on the far side of the lobby. And we look at this woman crossing the lobby. And I said, well, that's an American. And so she comes up. The ambassador was having a function in that hotel that night. And she comes up and she says, yeah, what are you guys doing here? I said, well, what are you doing here? She said, well, I came here for the wine. What are you doing here? And I told her, I said, well, I'm getting ready to talk in a church tomorrow morning. And she says, well, what are you going to talk about? And so I proceeded to tell her of my discussion, which was I was going to be talking about the foundation of human rights found in the 10 Commandments. And she said, oh, well, if that's what you're going to talk about, you need to talk to my boss. I said, well, who's your boss? Well, that's Tony Wright. He's the head of human rights issues for the nation of Georgia with the American Embassy. See you on Monday. So I gave the speech to the church on Sunday morning, and I gave it again to the ambassador and Tony Wright on Monday morning. And Monday afternoon, I gave it to what was essentially the Attorney General of the state of Georgia. And as I'm giving the discourse to the Attorney General of the state of Georgia, two other fellows walked in, and these were two Orthodox monks. And they sat down at the table. I was very intimidated, but nonetheless, I delivered my speech. I said, I'm not here to talk to you about UN rights. I'm not here to talk to you about the Declaration of Independence or human rights found in the US Constitution. I'm here to talk to you about the human rights found in the Ten Commandments. And I explained it to them. And they had their mouths, their chins on their chest. They couldn't believe what I was saying. But nonetheless, one of these monks, who was Basil Kovakidze, was the head of juridical issues for the Georgian Orthodox Church and an archpriest in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And he was fluent in 5 languages, by the way, and he'd been published in every major publication in Europe. And he came forward with an article expressing the idea that there was enough religious room to allow the evangelical church to become registered in Georgia. And so as a result of this conversation and this understanding, Zali's church actually became the first church to be registered in a different denomination other than the Baptist Union or the Pentecostal Union in the former Soviet Union since the creation of the Soviet Union. So, and in addition to that, Zali didn't go on to get registered in the church, but 2 weeks after we left Georgia, George Bush was coming into Georgia to speak. And Laura Bush's team came into Tbilisi, and the person at the embassy taking care of her team was Tony Wright. And Tony Wright had the opportunity to sit down with Laura Bush's team and talk to them about the expectation of human rights in Georgia predicated upon the Ten Commandments. So when George Bush got up in what they called Freedom Square, Svobodna Ploshad, in downtown Tbilisi, up the Rustaveli Street, he spoke in front of 350,000 Georgians, and he says, I know you have stood up the test of time to stand for your God-given rights. And when he said that, the roar of 350,000 people went up in the middle of that square. Okay. So, and who was sitting on the booth with George Bush, on the stand with George Bush, if it wasn't Zali Tekeshilishvili? So we saw many, many miracles happen in Georgia during that period of time. And these miracles were something that were taking place at the hands of Yah, not at the hands of me in any respect. However, I think on my last trip into Georgia, I ended up getting poisoned coming back on the plane. And I had to spend time in a hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. When we got back to Washington, D.C. But nonetheless, so the Ruach had me on a double course. One course was pursuing the teaching of the truth. And the other course was doing mission work in Eastern Europe at the behest of the Ruach HaKodesh. And I just want to say at this juncture, I made many friends in Georgia, and my heart still cares for them deeply. If we're talking about Bato and my friend Gennady Romanadze in Batumi, and Olegi over at the Pentecostal Union, and Zali Tekeshilishvili, and so on and so forth. These brethren were great people, and we did what we could at the time with the abilities that we had, which were meager, but they were what they were, and we did what we could do. And so blessings to you, brothers. Baruch atah b'Hashem yahusha. Now, so when I come back to the States, guess what? The pursuit of the truth is going to reveal something. And the pursuit of the truth began with me continuing to read and to expand the literature. And as I'm reading the literature, we're discovering one thing that becomes very, very clear. And that is the teaching on the Shabbat. Now, there was a fellow who was the pastor of this church that we were going to at that time. And he had a son, and his son's name was Michael. And Michael was emerging as a truly gifted teacher in the Ruach. And so Michael was given license to start a youth service, if you will, on Saturday evening. And Michael Ishmael, that was his name. And he began to teach, and he did a 5-part series on the Shabbat. And I'm listening to this teaching on the Shabbat, and it was just overwhelming. I mean, I'm reading this, and I'm hearing this, and the teaching about the Shabbat, quite incredible, and became very, very obvious to me that this was something very important in the teaching of the scriptures. And so, as time moved on, I was intending on returning to mission work, but we were going to do mission work in Greece and in Athens and in Saloniki in order to deal with what was happening there. And we did some of that mission work addressing the refugee crisis in downtown Athens. We worked with a mission group called the Athens Rescue Center, the ARC. And that also was an incredible blessing to me. But the year I intended to return to Greece for that purpose, well, a friend of mine says, well, you're not going to Greece this year. You're going to Israel with me. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? I'm going to Israel with you. Okay, all right. I guess I'll put off the trip to Greece because I was trying to work through a German mission group out of Stuttgart. But they wouldn't return my calls, to get into Thessaloniki for purposes of mission work. So I ended up going to Jerusalem. And when I went to Jerusalem, once again, the Ruach HaKodesh kind of took possession of me. And I'll share that with you too. That when I flew into Jerusalem, we had a long flight. And we got to Ben Gurion. It's only a 35-mile hop from Ben Gurion up to Jerusalem. And we were staying at the Dan Panorama in Jerusalem. And I walked in the door, and the team was sitting there having dinner. So I sat down, I had a cup of coffee, I had some food, and Peggy looked at me and she said, Stephen, we want to hear you prophesy at the piano. And I said, well, that's great, but I don't do that kind of thing. Oh, yeah, you do. I said, well, no, I don't. And Pastor Joey was like, yeah, come on. You prophesy at the piano, we'll interpret. So I said, okay, fine. So we go around the corner, we find this grand piano, and I start playing. And once the desk heard that I could play the piano, they were okay with me playing. So I'm playing, I'm thinking, okay, I'm thinking Zechariah 13, here's the prophecy for this place, gloom and doom. And Yah keeps taking it out of my hand and taking it out of my hand and taking it out of my hand. And pretty soon there's this glorious rain that is coming down in D flat major, over a D flat alternative chord. It's a D flat major 7 with a sharp 4. I'm playing this stuff, and this stuff is just raining down and just so beautiful. And finally, I just had to stop playing. I had to completely stop. And Joey and Peggy were out there interpreting all this. And Yah speaks to me quietly in my own heart. And he says, Stephen, he says, you have greatly underestimated the love I have for this place and these people. Now, this was in the first hour that I was in Jerusalem, the first hour. And so from this point, I would return to Israel in 2010, 2011, 2012. And suddenly, and here in 2011, Brad Huckins and I are walking along the streets in the old city. And it's the kind of thing that happened, right? We're walking along the streets, and we come onto this linen store. And I hear people in there talking in English, So I walk in the door. Who's speaking English here? I should have said, "Why are you all standing around?" But I didn't say that. Who's speaking English here? Well, there were 2 Orthodox guys sitting there at the counter, and the fellow who owned the store, who was making linen tallits and linen kippas, and so it was a loom he had going there. And so these guys said, "Well, who are you?" Blah blah blah. Well, the next thing we start talking, and these guys have had a ton of questions. And me, I'm the guy who's answering the questions. So here it was about, 3.5 hours later, the shop owner comes back in. "Can I have my store back now? Can you guys leave? Can I have my store back?" And we had talked for, 3.5 hours. We finally left, And from here, we walked over to the Tomb of David. Now, this was a very interesting circumstance because at the Tomb of David, We walked into the tomb of David. There was no one there. And except there was this little tiny Ashkenazi rabbi who was about 4'11", and this Sephardi rabbi, the Spanish fellow, standing there. And I walk in and I said, yeah, what's going on? And they said, well, do you want to pray? And I said, well, okay, yeah, sure, let's pray. So this little Ashkenazi guy, he's like, he couldn't speak a word of English, and I couldn't speak a word of Hebrew. But he starts looking at me. He says, okay, I want you to repeat after me. And I said, okay, all right. And so he begins with the Shema, And remember, he's only speaking to me in Hebrew, but I'm understanding him. And he says, Shema Israel. And I came back and I said, Shema Israel, yahuah Eloheinu, yahuah echad. And when I said that, the Sephardi guy just goes, what is this? And even a little Ashkenazi guy, he just keeps on pushing. And so we proceeded to pray the entirety of that passage out of Deuteronomy with the Shema, right here in the tomb of David. And so from this point, both of those rabbis said, well, we haven't seen anything like this. And Brad and I said, well, we're going to have to leave. So, we got out of there, we left. But this began kind of a completely different change in my life now, because I began to see, and we began to talk with many of the Orthodox. Well, what is this? What are you talking about when you start talking about Tehillim? Well, we're talking about, you call it the book of Psalms. We call it Tehillim. Well, what do you call Proverbs? We call it Mishlei. Oh, okay. So I'm beginning to read through the Tanakh and seeing what's going on with the Hebrew words and seeing what's there. And then, of course, you see the overwhelming tide of the evidence of this history in Jerusalem. And, we visited the synagogue in Hebron. We visited the synagogue at Marat Machpelah. We then visited the synagogues in the Old City, the three smaller ones that were the Portuguese and Spanish, and I forget the other one, the three that were there. We went into many of the synagogues in the north of the country. And of course, we went to Capernaum, and we took the Jesus boats out on the Sea of Galilee, and we did all that. And we went to Migdal, and we went up to Cepher, and we went up to Kiryat Arba, and we ended up in Haifa for a long time. In fact, Yah had pointed out to me, look, Stephen, you need to go and you need to rebuke. He told me, before I ever went to Israel, he told me in my prayer journal, he says, Stephen, he says, I'm calling you to something. He says, I want you to measure 110 kilometers northwest of Jerusalem. So I did, and I put it into Haifa. He says, I'm calling you to lift up your staff against that temple and to rebuke it. I'm like, what temple? What are you talking about? I don't have the slightest idea what you're saying here, nothing. And so I started looking at it, and I found that there was this temple that they call the Temple of Baha'i, but it really isn't the Temple of Baha'i, that is built on the top of the hill in Haifa, from whence the city gets its name, Haifa, Bahaifa. And he told me to go to that temple and rebuke it. Well, there was no chance of going to that temple because nobody ever wanted to go to Haifa. So we got there in Haifa in 2012 when we were going up to visit a church, the Kahila Carmel. We were going up to visit this church, and we had to pull over to use the bathroom, and we got lost. So David and Brad had taken off, and they were gone. They went to the church, and they never saw us again. So we're kind of wandering. I said, well, let's go into Haifa. So we went into Haifa, and we went, in fact, to that very spot where Yah had told me to go, to stand over the hill over the Baha'i temple and to rebuke it. And so I did. Now, I did a whole long study on that temple. It's actually the temple of the Bab and not a Baha'i. The Bab was actually the 12th Imam, if you will, the Mahdi for Islam. And Islam missed it because he was preaching peace and not war. And at any rate, it was his temple. The Baha'i temple's actually up in Akko, but it's another long story. However, in this trip, we determined the correct name for Yahweh, Yahusha. And we also determined in this trip, going down at Ein Kerem, which is the situs of the birth of John the Baptist, that there were Aleph Tavs contained in a proper translation of the New Testament. And so we began to look at 3 different versions of the New Testament in Hebrew. to ascertain the aleph tops. And we, at this point, made the decision that we were going to transliterate all of the names in Scripture back to their Hebrew originals so that people who spoke English could understand them. So for me, what really made the difference in my life was when we began the Bible study in 2010. And in 2010, a group of people came to me who had been studying the Truth Project with me. And they said, we want to study the Bible with you. And I said, well, if you want to study the Bible with me, you have to keep in mind, we're going to be reading the Bible. We're not going to be reading New Age pamphlets that have one verse in them. Well, some guy sells you his hype pop psychology program. That's not what's going to happen. It's going to be actually the reading of Scripture. And they said, okay, let's do it. And well, when we did that, we had no idea what was going to happen because our study exploded. It absolutely exploded. It was the greatest night of the week. It was a study that was unbelievable. It was just, we were bouncing off the ceiling with excitement with everything we found. And as Greg said, we started reading that section of the Bible where the gold pages were still stuck together, that section. And as we did, we discovered so many things. And so as a consequence, one night we were at the Bible study and somebody had announced that they were going to be releasing a new politically neutralized Bible. And I thought, how do you, with a proper deference to Scripture, release a politically neutralized Bible? How do you do that without changing the text? Well, they did it, and so I looked at Brad and I said, Brad, we should do something ourselves. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, let's do something that's just like extremely difficult to read, that's just impossible to read. And let's make it as difficult and as accurate as we possibly can, transliterating and doing all this other stuff. He says, okay, yeah, I'm good. Let's do it. So we did. Now, when we first did it, we began publishing the text for our Bible study. And, so we would publish like 4 books at a time. And initially they were in 2 books. And then we eventually got it into 1 book because we found a printer who could do it in 1 book. And they were paperback. And so we would kind of move one here and we'd move one here and we'd move one there. And with the expectation that, if our Bible study expanded, that we'd move, so we would sell a few more. Well, we got to a point where we got to 1 edition and I couldn't get it home. It would be taken. People would buy it out of my hand before I could get home. I couldn't even keep my own book. And I don't have my own book right now, by the way. So at any rate, when we were in Jerusalem in 2012 during Sukkot, we were there with the 4 families. And we decided at that point that we were going to launch the Cepher Publishing Group. And we were going to publish under the name Cepher, scroll, under the name Cepher. And so it was. We scraped together our pennies and we put together what we could. And we printed our first run of the Cepher, which was as large as Thomson Shore, our printer, could handle. It was the largest book they could handle. They couldn't go another page. We had to fight to reduce the margins and to reduce the headers and the footers until we could get everything contained within those last 8 pages. And so the first edition of the Cepher was born. And with that, then, I spent my time trying to explain what it was that we had done in the Cepher. And really, that's really been the course of action for the last 11 years now, has been explaining what we have done in the Cepher and why we did it. And as we do that, I discover more and more new things all the time. And so, in those new things, I try to share what I can. And of course, so we've had many videos that we have done trying to explain the Cepher and the teaching that we have. And of course, there's never been a charge for any of those. And in fact, we've never monetized those. We've just, put them up on YouTube for free so that people could watch. We've gotten into some trouble and had some videos taken down. Some of those videos that I did independently are on the Cepher website. If you go to cepher.net and you go into resources, you'll find those videos. And then, of course, we began launching the Sabbath group because I was routinely getting emails from people saying, I'm all alone in my walk. I came to this understanding. I came to understand the name. I came to understand the truth of Torah. I came to understand the Shabbat. I came to understand the feasts. I came to understand that I need to come out of Babylon and I need to walk the narrow path. And as soon as I did, all my friends quit talking to me. My kids won't talk to me anymore. I've been shunned. I've been blown out of the community and I don't have anyone to talk to. So when I got those kinds of emails, I said, okay, well, I'm going to launch a Sabbath study. And I'm going to launch a Sabbath study so that those people who are alone have someone to talk to, have someone to fellowship with, and so that they don't feel rejected, so that they know they're in a community. And since then, we've built many communities. We built communities on Telegram, and we built communities in the various states and in different countries where people get to know each other and recognize they're not the only ones. For instance, last Friday night, we had a gal named Brooke and her family that are being ostracized by their community because they're not of their religion. And they live in Tennessee. They live in central Tennessee, just south of Nashville. And they too are looking for community. They feel like they're all alone. And so, and then of course, what took place was that we began to build a community in the United Kingdom. And there are such blessed brothers and sisters in the United Kingdom, whether it's Shane and Jessica Knott or Stuart and Angela Birch, who are very good friends of mine. Paul Berry, who is just, I mean, he's my blood brother in the UK. And of course, I had a great love for Ross Broadstock, who died preemptively following our trip. And of course, my Irish brothers, Frank Smith, who I love dearly, who's a great brother, and he and his wife Mary, they were such great hosts for us in Ireland. It was terrific to meet him and Neil and of course Martina. And so these people, the fellowship that we had in Britain, which includes, of course, John Hallam and Malcolm as well, and Tony Wright and others, who have been a instrumental part in helping those who are becoming set apart, like Erna and Kim and others. And so the United Kingdom Fellowship is an extremely important fellowship to me. I hope to be seeing those brothers and sisters again, hopefully for Sukkot this year. I'm hoping we're going to be able to do that. Yah's blessing by the will of yahuah, as they say in the yhvh. And of course, the fellowship in South Africa, which, we just got back from South Africa on such a wonderful, wonderful trip, and to meet the Boer community and the remnant of the Huguenots and others in South Africa who have a heart and a yearning to hear the name Yah and to hear the truth of Scripture. And so, anyway, this completes my journey and my testimony. And just to say that I had none of this was on my bucket list. None of this was in my view at all in the 1990s. And I had no idea that this is where I was going to end up and that this would be what I would end up doing. It just never crossed my mind. But Yahuah has taken me because I said, here I am, Yah. Use me for the benefit of your kingdom in the way you see fit. And just to close my remarks now, I want to say this too. I feel the same way now, okay? That what Yah has in mind for me, and Stephanie is on board, we are prepared to do. We are prepared to do. And so if we know that the times coming are going to be hard, but they're going to be hard all over the world. So let us prepare to be strong in the strength of Yah, because this is what we have and we have nothing else. Remember, He is our strong tower. He is our fortress. By His name we are saved. We are covered under His wings. He is our deliverer. He is our savior. He is our salvation. He is our freedom. All right, so I want to thank you, and I'm going to try to message James here that I have now completed my discussion. And I just want to let you know that I'm very thankful for this opportunity to speak with you guys. And I hope you will come and catch me over at Cepher.net, or you can also catch me at Cepher Academy if you want to get into more intense discussion currently discussing the Ten Commandments. We're discussing the common law. We're discussing critical thinking. We're discussing ancient days and the history of Scripture. We also have classes on piano from scratch, studying the Masorot, even the ancient Paleo-Hebrew that Shel Wagner teaches. And I have a class on understanding the Hebrew alphabet. These classes are all there, and we're going to be doing a lot more classes. Be'ezrat Yah, by the will of Yah, we will be doing more classes and have more educational materials available to you at sepheracademy.net, sepheracademy.net. You can catch me on Telegram, my channel, Stephen Pidgeon. You can also catch me at Radio Free Alaska. And if you are a person who is interested in fellowshipping with other believers, come to the World Assembly of Yahuah, the Way, it's called the World Assembly of Yahuah on Telegram. We have many members, and I have to tell you, I'm greatly heartened because the communication today on the Way was so much different than last week. And it's been expression of love from the people one to another. And it's really quite exhilarating to see that we can actually come to this point between us, that we can find unity in the love of Yah. So I want to thank you, brothers and sisters, for staying a part of this show. And hopefully James is going to show up here and take care of the end of this. If not, I may have to start singing. That is possible. That's a possibility. I could get into singing. And so now, as we recap this, I'd like to say just a few more things too, since Yah has seen fit that the Ruach HaKodesh has seen fit that I'm not done talking. Then let me talk a little bit about some prophecy, a little bit about a prophetic voice. Okay, there are things coming in the world now that are going to be a complete paradigmatic shift, if you will. It's not going to be a great reset in accordance with the Nazi leadership coming out of the EU, because the Nazi leadership in the EU is about to perish, and they're going to perish precipitously. That is to say, it's going to happen quickly. And when it does, there's going to be many, many things that are going to take place in Europe that are going to be quite surprising. Of course, there's a revolution going on in France right now. That revolution is going to continue until there is a complete change of government. But the government in Germany is going to fall entirely. And the people of Germany are going to regroup under a kind of Germanic understanding that existed during the times of Goethe, during the times of Beethoven, during the times of Bach, during the times of the great intellectuals in Germany who preceded the crotch-scratching ignorance of Adolf Hitler and Richard Wagner. And this is going to be an entirely new German people, an entirely new German idea. And they will come under the name of yahuah, and they will come under the teaching of the Scripture anew, walking away from the lawlessness of Martin Luther into the premises of lawful conduct in being obedience to Yah. And they will regroup as a people, not as a nation state. They will not regroup as a nation state, not for many years, but they will regroup as a people. And as a people, they will confederate themselves with another group of people who are going to end up throwing off the chains of tyranny that sit over them right now, and that is the real Americans. The real Americans who will have also lost their nation will be joining with the real Germans who have lost their nation, and what's left of the French who have lost their nation, to confront and put an end to and put a final line to what is left of Western civilization. Now, as this begins to happen, bear in mind that we do have an obligation to our brothers and sisters in the wilderness who will be in the land south of Cush. And this obligation is to establish a nation of righteousness under the name of Yahuah. A nation not where a minority rules over a majority or a majority rules over a minority, but where Yah rules over all, as not a respecter of persons, but he who created us with the breath of Adam. This is the prophecy, and this is the way it is. So I'm going to leave you with that. So I want to thank you, brothers and sisters, and thank you for taking your time to listen to this old man pontificate and go on and on and on and on. I hope that you find this edifying. Baruch atah yahuah sevaot el kadosh echad yasharel avinu olam laolam yhvh yahuah v'yishmerecha yehir yahuah panav elecha v'yikunika Isa yahuah panav elecha lechem shalom b'shem yahusha HaMashiach. Amen.